So now let's look at our last functions, the type conversion functions. So far we've looked at three types: integer, float, and string. We're going to look at more types during the remainder of this course. But regardless of which type we're working with, we can always know that that type comes with a function named after the type that when it's called, it will convert its argument to an object of that type. So how do we use it? Well, here are int, float, and stir. As you can see, they're being used as functions. How do we know they're functions? Well, as always, if you have a pair of parentheses after a name, that indicates that that's a function. And the parentheses indicate that we're calling the function. Here, we're taking a string object, which could be a literal, but it could also be a variable. And we're converting that string into an integer. The string looks like a 5, but it isn't an integer 5. It's a string 5. In other words, it's a one-character string, a string with length 1. It has one character in it, and that character happens to be the numeral 5. But that doesn't make it an integer 5. The only way we can treat it as if it were an integer 5 is by converting it. Literally, what we're doing is producing a new object that is an integer based on the string that is that looks like a 5. When we look at float, we're now taking an integer 5 and converting it to a float. And you can do the same thing with int, converting from a float to an int. If we take the integer 5 and we convert it to a float, we get back 5.0. 5.0, of course, is the float version of integer 5. This also means, of course, that we could give it a string that looks like a float, and it would convert that string to a float. So the function will do its work as long as it seems appropriate. Lastly, we have the stir function, and you can see what it's doing here. We're giving it an integer. It's 55. And we're now getting back from stir a string, a two-character string with the numerals 5 and 5. So you can see that it's very straightforward to convert one object to another. And that conversion will happen as long as the value being passed is appropriate to the function. In other words, we can't just pass anything. If we look at this example, you can see that I am converting a string that looks like an int into an integer. I can go ahead and run this. You see 5, and you can see that that 5 is a class int. That's what's happening on line 7. I'm printing the type of this object. And sure, it is an integer. That makes sense. Everything went well. But what if I were to try to convert a string into an int, but the string doesn't look like an integer value? What would Python do? It's a good question. We've seen other exceptions in the past. Now we're going to see a new kind of exception, as long as I save my work. We see a new error type called value error. Now the value error type is one that indicates that the value that we used was incorrect. In other words, we tried to convert HELLO to an integer. Well, Python doesn't really know what we're on about when we say that. What do you mean convert it to an integer? It doesn't look like an integer. I don't know what integer you mean. I'm not going to guess. Other languages might actually guess. A language like Perl would actually take something like 55 hello and just convert that to integer 55, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to me anyway, but I think it probably does in certain applications. But Python won't do that. Python's not going to try to figure out anything for you. If you're going to ask it to do something, you're going to want to make sure that that's proper for that type. So you'll find a value error exception will occur anytime you're using an incorrect value. And for these functions, it should be relatively clear that the appropriate value is going to be one that really just looks like or seems like it ought to be convertible into that type.